It's my pleasure here to introduce some of the panelists today on this panel. So we have, sorry, I was sent some of these a little bit late. So Monica Meltis, who is the executive director of Data Civica, a Mexican-based NGO that works with statistics for human rights and capacity building for advocacy groups, journalists, and other NGOs. She studied political science and international relations at ITAM in Mexico City. We have Jorge Ruiz, who is a researcher at the Human Rights Program at the Universidad Iberoamericana, a Mexican university based in Mexico City. He leads the projects regarding great violations on human rights. And we also have Patrick Ball, who is my colleague at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, where he is the director of research. And so I'm really excited today to hear about a project that these three have been working on, which uses machine learning to predict the locations of hidden graves in Mexico. And so how I'm hoping we can start is, Monica, could you give us some context here? What's going on in Mexico with respect to the hidden graves? And why is the ability to be able to find more of them important right now?
Should we just...
Oh, yeah, sure, sorry.
We have prepared just a little presentation, if that's fine.
Please,
It'll be brief.
please.
So I'm just gonna pass the microphone to Jorge so he can explain.
Yeah.
First outline was it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No.
I didn't know that one went obsolete.
Well, hi to everyone. First of all, we want to say that we are very happy to be here. We want to thank the AAAS for the organization of this event, and we want to thank everyone in the room to come and hear us today. So, yes, we're going to present what we have been doing, our machine learning model to predict hidden graves or clandestine graves in Mexico. First of all, here's a brief outline of our presentation. This is what we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to open the session for some Q&A. But first, we want to give a brief context of what's happening in Mexico in terms of violence and human rights violations, and why are we doing this model, right? What's the aim, and why it's important to do these types of projects. And then we're going to enter in more details of how does the model work and some technical details that Patrick is also going to talk about. And then we will like to reflect of the use of machine learning for these projects regarding grave violations of human rights. Also a brief mention of what is happening also in Mexico in terms of identification of missing persons and what are the next steps for our project. So first, we have to know what's happening in Mexico, right? Mexico is going through a crisis in terms of grave violations of human rights. This is as a consequence of the strategy that started in 2006 with President Felipe Calderón, and then that continued with Enrique Peña Nieto, and now it seems that it's going to be continuing with our new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. This is a strategy that started in late 2006 to combat organized crime. The way that it's literally a use of force, deploying military and federal forces throughout different regions of the country. It started in the north, especially with Baja California and states, for example, like Coahuila and Nuevo León and Tamaulipas, but the strategy to combat organized crime then moved through a lot of parts of the country. So this has brought a spike of violence from state actors and non-state actors who are committing the violence, and especially we're seeing a lot of trends, for example, in homicides and disappearances, which is what's happening in terms of grave violations of human rights. Not only we are seeing disappearances committed by state actors, but also disappearances committed by non-state actors, and also other grave violations of human rights, such as extrajudicial killings and torture. In terms of disappearances, which is part of why this project started, we have to take into consideration also some numbers and some context, right? These are some figures of how many missing persons we have right now in Mexico, according to the official figures. There are more about 36,000 missing persons in the country. These are figures that were updated until April of 2018. Unfortunately, we haven't had an update in official figures of how many persons are missing in the country right now after April of 2018, but this is a part of the National Registry of Missing Persons in the country, and most of these cases were documented after the drug on war started. The war on drugs started in 2006. more than 95% of these cases were documented after 2006. So you can see that it's part of the violence that we are seeing as a consequence of this. And for example, we have had visits the first visit of an international organization was in 2011 with the working group on enforced disappearances of the UN. They came and they visited especially northern states in Mexico, and they said that disappearances is a widespread phenomenon in Mexico. And not only this, but some disappearances are similar to enforced disappearances. That's what they stated. Not only non-state actors were committing disappearances in the period that they came, but they said that also state actors were committing enforced disappearances in the country. And then the Committee on Enforced Disappearances emitted some observations to the country in 2015, and as you can see, the committee mentioned the same. The information received by the committee reveals a situation of widespread disappearances in the country. And then in 2018, October 2018, the committee mentioned this again. Mexico is facing a widespread situation of enforced disappearances in the country. So as a consequence of this, and as part of enforced disappearances, we are seeing the location of hidden graves or clandestine graves in different parts of the country. And this is why this project was created. We wanted at first to know what was the situation of clandestine graves in Mexico. How many graves have been found, for example, in northern Mexico or in south Mexico? And this has several goals. First, we wanted to show, well, if we want to solve this problem, we need to know what is the magnitude of the problem, right? So, and not only this, but what we have seen in Mexico is that unfortunately, a lot of the search efforts have been conducted by groups of families with missing relatives. That is, the state it's not still conducting its responsibility to do the searches. In 2018, in January 2018, we had a new law. It's called the General Law Against Enforced Disappearances, which it seeks or it foresees a creation, for example, of national search programs, national exhumation programs, and other public policy implementations regarding the subject. But since at least 2014, a lot of the efforts to look for these graves have been conducted by families, as we can see here in the picture. So this is a little bit of context and why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because the goal of the project is to identify municipalities or counties where we think there is a high probability of having clandestine graves that have not been reported yet, either by official sources or non-official sources. And why do we do this? Because knowing where to search will help create better public and non-governmental programs regarding missing persons in the country. So now I'm going to explain how does the model work. I'm going to give a brief overview of how does the model work, and then Patrick is going to talk us about more of the technical details. But first, we have to know how do we acquire the data, with what data we are working, right? So at our university, we started collecting information of clandestine graves or hidden graves reported by the press, national and local press, and also by official sources, especially state attorneys' offices or fiscalías as we know them. So we wanted to do this because what we have found, and Patrick is also going to talk more about, is that the press cover or report certain type of fossas or hidden graves, and state sources report other type of fossas and hidden graves. So this is important in order to know how are we dealing with this problem and what are the fossas that we haven't still observed by these two sources of information, right? So we created these databases from press release, and most of the official sources, we have to get them by freedom of information requests. That is, we also have to do a process of litigation sometimes to access this information, because sometimes authorities, they don't want to publish these types of information, so we have to fight for this information along with other allies who help us with this. So now I'm going to talk about how does the model work, right? In Mexico, we have 2,458 municipalities or counties. So as you can see, there are a lot of municipios in Mexico. And what we have done is, when we started this model 2 years ago, this is a random forest model, and now we're moving also to another type of algorithm, which is called Mies forest, which is a type of random forest. But we started this model 2 years ago, predicting municipalities for 2013 and 2014 using only the press reports. And then we started to making predictions for 2015 and 2016. But in order to do these predictions of municipalities that could have high probabilities of having clandestine graves that remain unreported, we have to do this first. First, we do a list of the 2,458 municipalities where first we mark with 1 the municipalities that have had observed fossas, that is by observed fossas or clandestine graves by the press, or observed fossas or clandestine graves by the official sources. Then we conducted some context studies of the municipalities where we think that it is difficult due to their characteristics to have clandestine graves. This is important because the model needs to learn during the training what municipalities are similar to the ones that have had fossas and what municipalities are similar to the ones that in which we believe it's very difficult to have clandestine graves. So these municipios where we think it's very difficult to have clandestine graves, we assign them a value of 0. And then we have the interesting ones, which are the minus ones. These are the municipalities that we don't know the answer yet, but the model needs to tell us the probability of these municipios to have clandestine graves or not. And how does the model do this? We then assign a lot of predictor variables. These are some examples of the predictor variables that we use. We use a lot of type of predictor variables during the training of the model. We show them the model only a half of the information during the training sets. And then when we show the rest of the information, the model has to tell us the importance of each predictor variable for each year. So this is just an example of how, of the type of variables that we include. For example, we have the number of missing persons in each county or municipality. We have for example, the average education rate of the municipality, whether there are municipalities in the borders or not, how many homicides there's also in the municipalities. And these are just examples of how the model tells us the importance of the variable during in time. We have to take into consideration that right now the most important, for example, condition for the model is the lagged predictions for previous years. What we have now, and we're going to show a little bit further, is we have now conducted predictions since 2009 till 2019 with information from 2019 till 2018 to see what are the probabilities for just the previous year. But it is important to know that the model works better when it knows the lagged probabilities. That is, when we have probabilities for 2017 or 2018, the model also learns with the probabilities that the model assigned for previous years. So the model uses these lagged probabilities and it uses them again for the training for the next probabilities or years that we are assigning. So these are just an example, and now we're going to talk about the technical details, and we're going to show our new results for 2017 and 2018, and also for prior years from 2009 till 2012. So thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. This is a real pleasure to be here. I worked in this building from 1996 until 2003. And I don't think I've been in this auditorium since 2003, so it's a pleasure to be back here after many years. So I'm going to start with just some key technical details. And in a machine learning context, working in an area like this, one of the most important of the concerns to take into consideration is what do we do with the missing data in the predictor variables? A lot of the predictor variables are measured fairly haphazardly across the 2,400 odd municipalities of Mexico. And so we have a tremendous amount of missing data across the approximately 55 independent variables. And so in the past, in our earlier iterations, we used the classic recommendation from the original random forest paper to assign some measure of central tendency of the non-missing data to the missing values in the predictor variables. More recently, in the last about 6 years, there's growing research that using a simple fixed imputation like that leads to different kinds of biases in the modeling. So we've used a new technique, and we just kind of have been playing with this last week, and we've discovered that indeed the modern research is correct. Using an iterative random forest approach to impute the missing data before you then use some other machine learning approach, in our case that's another random forest, to do the prediction of the dependent variable, turns out to have an enormous improvement. It has a tremendous impact on the prediction. And so here's how good those predictions are. Here are 4 years, and for each of the 4 years, I'm showing on the horizontal axis the probability for some municipalities that we predict there to be a a hidden grave. And these data are for only the municipalities for which we know the answer. We know whether or not there was a clandestine grave found in that municipality or not. And these are municipalities that were not used in the training. So this is the test data. So this is a hard test of the model. And what we see is that for almost every one of these cases, we have a perfect separation between the non-grave municipalities and the municipalities in which graves are found. There are exceptions. So for example, for 2015, predicting the graves that are documented by the Attorney General's office, we have 2 municipalities in the test data which we predict to have no grave, which in fact, but a grave was found. You see those on the top in the 1 line. So that's a mix. Those are false negatives in our prediction. Those are errors. But in most of the others, we get a pretty good separation. We're able to predict the cases in which we observe graves pretty effectively. When we model that using an area under the curve measure, we find that for all of our year predictions, so we have from 2009 to 2018, and then we have 2 sets of predictions for each year for each of the 2 measures of the dependent variable. I'll talk about that distinction in a moment. We have an AUC above 0.95 and in most cases above 0.99. So we have very, very high predictive capacity in these models. And the reason is not because our model is fancy. It's not because somehow we've done something technically wonderful here. It's because the difference between municipalities in which clandestine graves are found and those in which they are not found is very clear. It's easy to do this prediction. The data from the predictor variables is really strong. So when we show, for example, a map of the municipalities in which we predict there to be a high probability of finding a hidden grave, when we make that prediction and we show it to area experts in Mexico, they're like, well, yeah, of course those municipalities have high probabilities of there being hidden graves. There's a lot of violence there. We know this from qualitative sources and local area expertise. So we find that very interesting. We get a lot of good qualitative validation from the people who know this stuff. So let me show you a map where we iterate over years from 2009, 10, 11, 12, and so forth. And we can see the pattern of our prediction moving around the country over time. And Monica will speak to some of this, and we've gotten some additional validation from that. But this is the kind of result. Let me see if I can get it to go one more time. Come on, thing. There we go. Let's do it one more time. This is the kind of result that we're presenting to our partners both in the advocacy community as well as in the state, as well as in media and academic sources. We're trying to say, hey, listen, here's a way to understand this pattern of hidden graves across the country that's changing in time, it's changing in space, but it's changing in ways that we can predict from other observable variables. This should no longer be completely opaque. And that turns out to be useful to them. So I want to turn to, there we go, to one last question, which is my concern about bias. I worry about bias all the time. It's pretty much my fundamental concern. How do we know if we're getting the story right? When we're doing some sort of statistical projection, in what sense can we talk about the limits of the generalizability for that prediction or the limits on our interpretation? Well, one is to say, well, we have 2 in this case, 2 different dependent variables that we're predicting. One are graves observed by the Attorney Generals of Mexico, and another are graves that are observed in the press. Those are represented here on the vertical axis by the term Fiscalia and on the horizontal axis by the word Ibero. And we're making predictions, in this case for 2016, for municipalities. So each dot on this graph is a municipality. And the location of the dot shows its relative prediction on these 2 different models. So the dots in the upper right are the cases in which both models, the model trained on data from the Attorney General and the model trained on data from the press, both models predict that that municipality has a high probability of having a hidden grave. And then the other 3 quadrants have other combinations of predictions I'll get to in just a second. The coloring on the dot indicates whether or not we've observed graves in those municipalities. So the purple dots are those in which we've observed graves from both sources. Green that are those that we predict a high probability, but we have made no observations. Light blue, municipalities that have observed a grave by the Fiscalia, but not by the press. Red is the other way around. And then white are those in which we've assigned a 0 likelihood of finding a grave. So it is gratifying to us that those dots in purple are found in the upper quadrant. That indicates that when a grave is observed by both data sources, we generally predict it to have a high probability of observing a grave. That's validation. Again, this is, these are held out test cases. These are not cases used in the training of the model. The other cases are those in which we have no observations or observations only one, we can scatter. But the ones that are both are held out test cases. The light blue dots, though, and the red dots have a concerning pattern. And this is the one that I want to flag in this notion about bias and the limits of interpretability. In the lower right quadrant, we see red dots that are on the bottom half. Now, they're toward the right, which indicates that using the data that we did in fact observe, because these are cases observed by the press data and documented by the Iberoamericana and Jorge and his colleagues, we make a strong prediction above 0.5. But with the other model, using the data from the Fiscalia, we're making a low prediction, below 0.5. Similarly, in the upper left quadrant, we have light blue dots that have a high prediction from the data from the model on which they were conditioned, but low probabilities assigned by the model from the other kind of data, from the data from the press. This tells us something that I think is really important, and this is something often overlooked when we talk about the use of machine learning to predict social phenomena, which is that these different data sources are modeling different things. There are different kinds of graves, fundamentally, represented by information presented by the Fiscalia than the information that's presented by the press. Different kinds of graves appear in these 2 data streams, which means that a model that we build is not modeling graves in some abstract and epistemologically satisfying sense. It is modeling graves that are like the graves in the rest of that data stream, which is a much less satisfying kind of prediction in a substantive sense. But I think intellectually, it's a very interesting problem. What do we mean by finding a grave? That turns out to be very complicated. And so before I'm going to leave that there, that wildly open question, to my colleague Monica, who will talk more about the use of machine learning for these types of projects.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to present some of the results we have for previous years that we've never presented before. And I think it's interesting because, and thank you, Patrick, for introducing the graphs for me. This on the right hand of the is 2009 predictions, which is the first year that we ever started working with. So this means that this has no lagged observations. This is why there are a lot of municipalities not on the upper right quadrant, but just in the middle one. But we wanted to show this because it is very interesting for us that those municipalities on the green dots that are municipalities with high probability but with no observation in neither of the sources, which we think are those interesting ones for in terms of what can we do with this project, in terms of searching for new graves that have not been found yet. I just want to say that all of the green ones that were appointed in 2009 as high predictions value were actually municipalities that found where there was found graves on the next years. So this is also another way to validate our model. So just to tell you an example, you probably know Playas de Rosarito, if you've ever been to Tijuana. Playa de Rosarito is a municipality in Baja California, and in 2009, and before, in the previous years, there has never been an observed grave. But after 2009, around 2014, there were graves founded. Also, Matamoros and Gomez Palacio, for example, that's a municipality in Durango, have had recurrent graves on the previous years after 2009. So this is important in terms of what can we do with this modeling. First of all, we know that this model it is very accurate on predicting graves. So we should be talking a little bit more about whether we can talk to other actors, like state actors and non-state actors, because as Jorge just said, currently in Mexico, the most important searching figures and actors are the families of the disappeared ones. On the other hand we can have the other graph is the 2018, which is the latest year we're modeling, and you can see we have also higher probabilities than in 2009. This is also because of the lagged data, and those are like really interesting findings, as Patrick said, if you know a little bit about the context in Mexico. There are many municipalities where there's starting to be a lot of violence in the previous years. So also an interesting thing on the modeling that we have found is that it is very accurate on predicting how geographically the violence is moving across the country. In Mexico, we have a very localized and focused violence geographically, but it is changing a little bit over time. It is moving right now to the center of the country where many municipalities did never have a historical violence, such as Guanajuato, Colima, and other states in the middle of the country. And a lot of those municipalities are being predicted in these 2018 results that were not being predicted on the previous years. So this is also an interesting, an important finding, I think, when talking about not only the statistical, which is really important part, but in terms of what can we do with the model. I just want to talk a little bit about what have we been done with the model. We also, as Jorge said, our primary interest is making this tool available for advocacy groups, and which are mainly families, organized families of enforced disappeared people. So we have a couple of models already that are being used, a couple of organizations that are using our model for advocacy purposes. In Chihuahua, for example, we have an ally organization that have been doing a little bit, like they have been talking to the attorneys for a really long time to go and do searches in two specific municipalities, Cuauhtémoc and Guadalupe Calvo in Chihuahua. And the Attorney General and the local attorney were not being very responsive about this in the previous years. And after we came with some of the results, these organizations went to the local attorney and said, look, we have a fundamental, like a scientific evidence that there are a lot of chances that these municipalities have graves. So now they have been doing a lot of work with the local attorneys. Also, this is, as Jorge already talked, this is a tool for the implementation of the new law, that's the General Act Against Enforced Disappearance and Disappearance Committed by Non-State Actors, that have the mandate of creating a national searching system to deal with the phenomenon of disappearance, and also to generate a national exhumation program. And we think these are interesting and important tools to guide a little bit the search. So we're also trying to talk a lot with state actors for incorporating scientific methods such as this one in their generation of the searching plan. They're currently doing a plan in the north of the country. Just really quickly, because I know we have. Okay. I thought we didn't. So just continuing with the context a little bit, I just want to tell there is right now, as Jorge already mentioned, there is a widespread crisis on human rights violation in Mexico, but I want to point out, when we're talking about graves, it comes a lot of conversation along with this on how are we identifying people. And right now there is also a very important crisis on the identification of missing and enforced disappeared people. So just a little bit of numbers, according to about the genetic profiles versus the number of identifications in the country. According to the Federal Attorney Genetic Database, the public one at least, there are 42,467 genetic profiles in their hands, but only 661 identifications. So this is just like 0.5%, is not enough, obviously, and it is like really scandalous numbers for us. And also on the federal police genetic data set, there are around 6,000 genetic profiles, and they have no report on how many people have been identified. So I think this is also important, just to get in a little bit of sense of how what is going on in the country. And just to finish up, I want to talk a little bit about our next steps as a project. The most important thing, one of the most important things also, as Patrick pointed in terms of bias, is that we need to get more data. More data basically means a possibility to have better trained models, and this means basically that we can predict more types of fossas. As Jorge and Patrick already said, right now we can predict the type of fossas that are similar to those reported by the press or those observed by the federal attorney and the federal and the local attorneys. But we're interested in trying to predict and understand other type of graves. Mainly and most importantly, since in Mexico, the families are those who are looking and those who are actually finding a lot of graves, and they are documenting all of this information. We are very interested in talking to the collective and organized families and to other NGOs that are doing a lot of frontline work with at a very local level with families and with families looking for graves. So we are trying to do a lot of work to find and have this data. And also, one of the other important aspects to look at is continuing building on better zeros, which are the municipalities that we believe that have a very, very low probability of having graves. And therefore, since we need to train the model, we have to try to think of other ways, sociology, and like qualitative ways of understanding the phenomenon and thinking how can we get better municipalities classified as zeros. And on the third level, we have been talking a lot about like inside conversations and also with other non-state actors a lot of what are the possibilities of doing geographical predictions. Right now, all of our predictions are on municipality level, and the variance of municipalities in Mexico is very high. We have very, very small municipalities, but also very, very big ones. So it is hard to say if, for example, Ecatepec, that's the biggest municipality in Mexico. Okay, so fine, we know that there are high probabilities of having graves there, but where inside of the municipality? And we are talking about this. There are many possibilities on using satellite images, and we're still talking to see what are the implications and the risks also. So that would be all. This is our contact information, and thank you very much for listening. We're glad to answer questions as well.
I have a couple follow-up questions for the panelists because we do have about half an hour left, and then I will open up the floor to outside questions, if that's okay with everybody. So the first question I have is, Patrick left us with kind of with a little bit of a provocation there about, what are we even predicting, right? Like, what does this all mean? We saw some systematic differences between the types of predictions that were coming out of the model trained with data from one data source versus the other data source. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists want to expand on how they interpret the predictions differently that come from the two different models, and also if the ways in which those models have systematically differ have revealed any sorts of bias in the data collection itself from the different organizations. So what sort of qualitatively have you taken from where the two different sources are focusing their efforts to document the different types of graves based on your own predictions?
Yeah, well, of course, there are many implications on the bias. Right now, as I was telling, there are many. It is very different data, the one that the federal attorney and the official authorities have, the press data, and on the colectivos and the families. There are many places where there are not a lot of press, actually, freedom of expression as well. So, for example, we have Tamaulipas, that's the north of the country, and there are not many information if you are trying to look at the press information. But if you want to talk to the colectivos, they will probably have a lot of information on where the graves are. No, so right now we're very interested in like moving along on finding new data and trying to impute these to our models and to understand what other types of graves we have as well. I don't know if you want to complement a little bit.
Yeah, I think I will add, especially there's a problem of how we collect the data from the official sources. And it's, we have like two main hypotheses of why are we giving this type of information, or why do we don't get access to this type of information. So one hypothesis is that state authorities, they have not seen the importance of why it is important to document clandestine graves, right? Since we are still in the middle of the human rights crisis, they are like, well, maybe it's not my priority to have right now a data set of clandestine graves. Maybe I need to conduct investigations, right, of the crimes that we're seeing. But the other hypothesis is that also there's probably a policy in some states to not provide information regarding grave violations of human rights in the country. So we have to deal with these types of issues when we are collecting the information. And also, as Monica said, there is also a problem with the press reports, that maybe the press is not able to how to report or give information of fossas in all the parts of the country. And I think what it's important to have in mind is that the modeling is, we're modeling like the social production of information of this phenomenon, and it's the social production either by official or non-official sources. But that's something that I think that's why we are using machine learning. We can know the bias from the sources of information, and we can work with the bias in order to predict municipalities that have not been observed by either these two types of social production of information. So.
I'd love to jump off of that. I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about as scientists doing work in any social space, but I think particularly in human rights, is it's super unclear what it is we're estimating. The relationship between the thing we measure and the social construct that we're talking about is a lot of slippage. There's enormous complexity in that. And we can do our best to try to bound the interpretation on what we're saying. We can try to be really, really careful in what we talk. But when we think that that's what people hear, well, my colleagues and I often call that the caveat fallacy. Nobody's listening to the caveats. They're going to take away the top-level interpretation. So we're predicting graves. Well, okay, we can't control the way our work is interpreted, perhaps, but what we need to be very thoughtful about is there's only a fraction of the graves that are going to be visible, and a fraction of those are the ones that are predictable. So what is that distinction? Well, I think Monica and Jorge have given us some indication of how the production of information gives rise to a particular kind of grave that becomes observable and therefore predictable. I think that if disappeared people are, if their bodies are destroyed, if they're hidden effectively in very deep graves, if their bodies are dumped in the sea, they don't have graves that will be observable, and therefore we're not predicting them. So there's a lot of complexity there. And as I reflect on almost now 30 years of doing this work in different kinds of estimation, each of those estimations, it occurs to me, has some sort of very complex interpretation limitation, which I guess I grow more sensitive to as I look at more projects that are observing things. And I'm making a big deal of this on this panel today because we're doing a lot more with data than we did a short time ago. And so I think that places upon us an obligation to be even more thoughtful about what it is that data means. Now, we can think about its production mechanism and we can wave our hands qualitatively, and I think that's important to do as a starting point. But we also need to model for those differences, and that's what we're trying to do in this sense of observing the difference in the prediction between the two dependent variable observations, and now figure out, is there some way to construct another measure? Not an average, not just putting them together, but coming up with some kind of model that tells us why these cases are different. That requires a big step outside of machine learning and back toward inferential modeling, which carries with it much more complex assumptions. Machine learning has relieved us of many of the assumptions that inferential learning put on us, or inferential estimation put on us. But I think we have to reassume those things and try to figure out why we have, what the differences are between these data streams in order to figure out what's not there.
So I think, a lot of what we're talking about is these different predictions having sort of different types of bias. That's what it sounds like to me when I'm hearing what you guys are saying. And I think there's this tendency to believe that more data means less bias, which is not necessarily true. But I'm wondering if in any of your opinions, there is some sort of data source that could get you towards less biased predictions in one way or the other, or perhaps other data sources that would get you to much more biased predictions. If you care to comment on that.
Well, I would say that we're very interested in understanding, on having better understanding on how are the patterns of the graves that are being found by the families and the colectivos. We're not sure if this would lead us to more or less bias, but we are very much interested in that information because in the Mexican context, these are the people that are finding the most. So, and they are finding the most in places where there is not necessarily a lot of like authority presence, or not necessarily a lot of press presence. So, also, I think it is important to say, as Patrick just mentioned, that the pattern of inhumations in Mexico is also changing a little bit. So that raises another question on how we are trying, or how we will deal with this bias. So they are not doing a lot of, they're not doing only graves anymore. They're trying to do, the perpetrators are using other methods as well that does not allow us to observe those inhumations. No, they're not necessarily graves. They're just like, I don't mean to be very graphic here, but like dumping places, or they dissolve bodies. So it is difficult to think about the biases that can lead us to having more data, but we're definitely interested in getting this data. Also because it is, I think, like on a personal thing and on a personal term, and I think I share this with Patrick and Jorge, those are our most valuable, advocacy working people with. So we're interested in recognizing the work they're doing, and I think that by including this data, it is one way we can recognize that effort they're doing. So yeah.
I think the notion of bias fundamentally implies that we understand something about reality, something that's deeply true. In statistics, we talk about the distinction between a parameter, which is this true value in the universe, which we cannot observe directly, and a statistic that we calculate from data. And the notion of bias is that the statistic is in some way systematically different from this parameter that we can't observe directly. Well, we can't observe it directly, right? So in some sense, we're always speculating about bias. It's very difficult to do much about it unless we can come up with wildly different measures, and we say, well, these are really different, so either one of them is biased or both of them are biased. And I think that we're in this situation enough to say they're both biased. And I think everything's biased. And I mean, everything that we can measure is biased pretty much. And I guess as my career has gone on, I've become more convinced that we know less than I thought in the previous year of my career. And this is a very frustrating thing to realize, but in some ways it's also a reinforcement of the kind of importance we place on estimations of variance, so at least we can bound what it is that we are sure we don't know, or how much we can be sure we don't know. Now, a biased measure does not make it useless. A biased measure may still be extremely useful. And in particular, I think the ones we're presenting today are extremely useful because there are graves there. The bias that we're talking about is that there are municipalities that have graves that we are not predicting. So we have a problem of false negatives, not so much a problem of false positives. Our positives are pretty strong, and I think that we've shown good evidence of that, and we have now post hoc validation of that kind of finding. But our false negative problem is significant, and I think that this is, in this particular context, the kind of bias that we're struggling with, and that I think all of our statistical problems should be struggling with. We may overestimate magnitude too. I think that's a different kind of bias, but here it's the false positive problem, the false negative, excuse me, problem.
So I take it that you three are not yourselves out looking for graves. So I'm hoping, maybe Jorge, that you can expand a little bit on how you connect the predictions and the science to the people on the ground actually using these predictions to look for more graves.
Yes, I think that's what's most important to us. We have to recognize that it's the families that have been conducting the searches for a very long time, even before we started doing this project. So it is important to us to help them in ways, right? In the end, it's also the responsibility of the state to be conducting these searches, but in reality, we're not seeing that still, throughout the whole country. That's why groups of families started, organizing and conducting searches first for example, in 2014 in the south of Mexico, in Guerrero and Veracruz, but also in previous years we had groups of families looking for their relatives in the northern states, like in Coahuila and Nuevo León. So first we have like a big challenge on how do we communicate these results, or how do we make them accessible to them? We have to be the less technical possible, but they have to understand how this can help their search process and their advocacy processes, as Monica said, like they are doing in Chihuahua, or right now we're also working with a group of families in Nuevo León, which is called Fuerzas Unidas por Nuestros Desaparecidos en Nuevo León. What they are doing is they will receive our new predictions and they will present them to the state attorney's offices, and it's like, look, this model is telling this, and since you are now creating a regional search program, you can take this into consideration for your context studies, or to program your search programs. But first, it's like a matter of how you are able to translate these results to experts, but and also families who are experts, but with different kinds of knowledge, because they even know more about also how a clandestine grave is found, or what are the characteristics. But it's of how you can take both knowledges and lead them into good advocacy strategies with the authorities now we have to push authorities to do these searches. And I think this is how it works in general now in the country. Since we now have general law against enforced disappearances, it is now the obligation of the state to start conducting these searches. So now the families are, we can start, we are going to continue to do search strategies. We have to continue looking because it's also our right. But we also have to push authorities, and I think this is a way in which we can help them to push for more rigorous search from authorities.
So to the extent that people are actually using your probabilities or your model output to direct their resources and to direct where their searchers are going to be going, it occurs to me that that could perhaps create some sort of feedback loop where you find graves in the places that your model predicts, and in the subsequent years you use that data to train future models, and the model sort of keeps saying the same things because you're finding the graves where your model told you to look for them, reinforcing that same pattern. I'm wondering if you guys have any sort of ideas about how you'll combat that problem going forward to create models for the future, and technical fixes, on the ground sorts of fixes, anything like that. All three of you.
The most straightforward way is to try to avoid using data that's created by the search process, motivated by our model, back for subsequent iterations of the model. I mean, the clearest way would be to use some sort of completely exogenous data stream for the model conditioning, exogenous with respect to the observations that are generated by search processes that come from our model. That's probably inseparable, but so far I don't think we have to face it. But that would be the first thing to do, is just, well, you know, if you went and looked with our model, we can't use that observation in the subsequent conditioning.
Yeah. I think it's also a little bit difficult to I mean, our model is mostly used for like advocacy, but I don't know, it is hard to say that our model is being used for like searches just because of the model itself. There is a lot, I mean, the families already know a lot about where the model are, about where the graves are. So it is hard for me to imagine a moment where the only source of information for going out and looking for a grave is our model.
Yep. Great, I think that's a fantastic answer. So one more question for you, just going a little bit more deeply into how the people who actually have this sort of firsthand information are going about it. What are some of the challenges they face in terms of collecting data, making data public, systematizing the data, and sort of maybe put more of a human face on it? Is anybody afraid to report or collect the data? What is that like for the people who are on the ground involved in this?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question. It is very, very challenging. We have to remember that right now, different from other countries that are going through similar things on similar types of violence, the Mexican context is one where there is an increasing violence, which means that going out and looking for graves is a very, very high risk thing to do. And the families are doing so, like literally putting their lives on risk. And I mean, this is the most important challenge for them. But also I would like to say, I mean, there are many, unfortunately, cases where families are being threatened, where families are actually being disappeared just by looking for their relative ones, or even killed. So that is one important thing to say. Another thing I would like to say is that on the more technical part of the response is that there are many challenges on systematizing the information. I think that a lot of families are doing a very good job on documenting, but not necessarily on the systematization of the information. This has a lot to do with time, resources, and just basically they're just families that had other like lives, and they were not trained for this, and now they are being trained in time. So it is very hard for a lot of them to now have to learn many of this stuff that they didn't do before, without resources and in a very hostile environment. I'm sure you have something to say.
Yeah, yes, I think what Monica said, it's important. It's not like the context, for example, in former Yugoslavia or in Argentina, where the violent moment had already passed now, and then you started to create exhumation programs. Right now, the violence is still there, and I think there's also a problem now with authorities of how are they documenting this information, because also the general law foresees that we have to create a national registry or a national database about clandestine graves. But the authorities right now are dealing, well, since when are we going to start documenting these cases? we have clandestine graves that are being found right now, but they also have to collect all of the information from previous years and from different states, and that they have had very different systematization processes of the information. So I think that's also one of the big challenges that we're going to face, or we are facing right now, and we are also trying to look or how we can help authorities have a better process of the systematization of their information, because it is now an obligation to have a national registry of clandestine graves in the country. And this will have to move also to the states, in the 32 states of the country. They will have to create their own registries, not only for clandestine graves, but for missing persons. And we have to know how many of these persons were disappeared, that is, a crime was committed, or how many persons, it's another type of disappearances, or that can be involved in the phenomenon in Mexico. So I think these are also important challenges that we're going to see, and we have to know how is the registration processes of the authorities and also from the colectivos, and how we can help them to systematize their information so we can then use it for our models.
All right, so before I open it up to questions from the floor, anyone have any final thoughts, anything they didn't get to say that they'd like to say? This is optional, so a no is fine across the board.
I think I just would like to say, because we're here in this auditorium, in the AAAS, that for us has been very important to understand the power of science in social processes. As we already said, the families here have like first-hand information of where the graves are. And a lot of them are not being listened by the authorities. So when we come up with a model that has a scientific background and it is scientific evidence, the response of the authorities are very, very different. So I would just like to say this in this venue, because I think that it is very important that the scientific work get some feedback of how their work can impact in very different ways and very powerful ways.
Yes, I would like also to add that at least how we are approaching this type of work in Mexico is that, okay, we may have a scientific tool, but we do not try to impose this scientific view to the groups of families, right? They have a lot of knowledge, and it's not like, well, we're scientists, we know how to do it. It's not like that. We're families, you know what you are doing, and we're just trying to help. And I think that's also an important approach to how we are doing science, right? It's not like a top-down position of, well, here's knowledge and use it. No, it's like how we can learn from your knowledge as groups of families and then use it for our model and then give it back to you again, because I think that's the most important thing of working along with these processes, and especially with this type of grave violation of human rights, which is enforced disappearances. And I think that's it.
I appreciate Monica calling out that we're at AAAS today, and in that vein, I think it's a good thing to acknowledge where this work came from. And so I'd like to thank publicly Audrey Chapman in particular, who was the director of the Science and Human Rights Program here in the 1990s, who I think really led much of the work applying science to the study of human rights. She was joined from the American Statistical Association by Mary Gray, by Fritz Schuren, and by Herb Speyer. And I think those four people in particular are people to whom those of us doing science in the service of human rights now owe a tremendous debt of gratitude. And so it's a pleasure for me to publicly acknowledge them.
Great, so we have several minutes for questions. If people would like to come towards the microphones, that would be great. And we have one on each side, in case you haven't noticed. All right, let's start over here.
Hey, great. Fantastic model. Two questions as to what's being predicted. I guess it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, one thing you could say what you're doing is creating a predictive model of lagged indicators of violence, right? Because the underlying data generating process that puts people in clandestine graves is violence. So for your false negative problem, have you thought about more direct observations of that data process? So looking at other measures of violence to help bootstrap where you're getting false negatives. That was the first. The second, Amnesty has spent a lot of time pouring through satellite imagery, looking for clandestine graves. Anything that helps narrow and get the haystack a little smaller is very welcome. So, to that end, going to the sub-municipal level will have, tremendous impact, not just for Mexico, but potentially elsewhere. And that made me think, what is the relevance of the municipalities themselves as units of analysis? Are they embedded in the data generating process, or is this just a convenient way spatially to organize the data? And the corollary to that is, when you're going sub-municipal, what kind of data inputs are you looking for predictive capabilities? I know there are folks working on, distance to roads and those sorts of things as predictors, and sort of how you're arranging that.
So most of the predictors we use are not violence related. And in fact, roads, the number of miles or kilometers of paved highway per municipality is actually one of the stronger indicators that we use, which I think is fascinating. Because it's a random forest, we should be clear that an indicator is neither positive nor negative. It can be both in the same model, so we don't have an inferential interpretation of what that means, but we do know that it's really important. I'm really hesitant to introduce, and this has been a very intense conversation among our team. I'm very hesitant to introduce additional measures of violence into our predictions. And my concern is less technical and more sort of intellectual. I think that the measures of violence are going to be endogenous to the thing we're predicting. And there's a danger of tautology, because every way we measure violence is itself conditioned by the same social processes that govern visibility. I mean, much of my other work in the prediction of homicides and disappearances, where we don't observe much of them, has shown that there's huge variability in the rate of observation. And that variability would, I think, be deeply correlated with the same processes that create our false negatives now. So I'm concerned about it. We've used them. We use measures of observed homicides and disappearances in the model, but I'm worried about it. And I would rather not use them, because I'm concerned about this sort of endogeneity problem inside the notion of what we mean by information. It's something we're continuing to discuss and debate, but it worries me because of this kind of circularity.
Yes, and I think that right now working at the municipality level has proven good to us, because geographically it's like a good space to control for our modeling, right? And also it's how a lot of the information is produced in Mexico. Most of the information that is produced, for example, by the national institutes in geography or for homicides or disappearances, most of the data is at a municipal level. We don't have more disaggregated data. So I think those are the two reasons that we are still using we are doing the predictions at the municipality level. One, because it's a good geographic space to control, and the other one is how the information is being produced in Mexico. We are also exploring other types of models, or, for example, geographical information systems for the observed fossils, but this has been a whole other process, because we have to identify the coordinates of the finding and then putting them in a geographic informational system. But yes, we're also exploring other ways and how we can use that to bring it back to the model that we are showing right now. But I think that that's also an answer.
All right, great. How about over here?
Hi, thank you very much for this great presentation. I also have two questions. The first one is, I was wondering, based on what criteria or characteristics you assign zero values to municipalities? And the second one, Patrick, you touched a little bit on this in your first answer. I'm not very familiar with random forest models, so could you explain a bit more about the predictive values of the different variables and what kind of policy relevance maybe also comes out of finding that something is important in predicting these graves? Thanks.
Well, the first question I can answer. The zero, it is a big discussion. I mean, we have been working like political scientists and international relations and like social scientists on trying to figure out how to classify a zero. the main thing we have been doing is generating like a local context analysis. So we get in a lot of deep on where is this municipality. So we like literally search the map and we go do some Google satellite images to see how is it is if it's near the mountains. I mean, a lot of things have to do with qualitative stuff. How, if we have people that are from there, we ask them. So we have like 10 or 11 criterias that are, it is a very, we take a lot of time doing the zeros, and we are a team of around, this last round were like 10 people, just like analyzing what is going on a local level. But of course, we have, like we really want to, I mean, this is a continuous discussion. How do you know if this is a place where there are no graves, or like we are doing it in a qualitative way? Yeah.
Yes, and I think it is a challenge because we would like to add, for example, even more zeros to the model because we know it would help the model during the training. But yes, we're still having a lot of discussions of how can we add more zeros, and especially how can we make them vary in time. We don't want to have like statical zeros throughout the years because it won't help the model. But yes, you have to take into consideration a lot of things. For example, some of the municipalities we have with zeros are in fact municipalities that have high levels of violence, but we know that it's different types of violence not related maybe to what we observe when there's a clandestine grave, or right because of the geographical characteristics of that municipality. Even though if it has a high levels of violence, we think it is very difficult to have a clandestine grave because, I don't know, the urbanization or things like that we have to consider. But we also know that there are other municipalities that are very disconnected and they don't have, for example, access to roads, or which perpetrators also use these types of infrastructure to create this type of crimes. So these are examples of the discussions we have to take into consideration when we are building the zeros, and what we are planning to do also for in the future is we want to include also more local knowledge from different states, and this would have to be also a long process. For example, creating workshops, I don't know, with groups of families or NGOs who are working also in different states, or well, what do you think of, what are you observing right now in some municipalities, and do you think this could be a zero, or should we leave it as a -1? We definitely want to continue working with the zeros, but it is important to have these talks, and at least I think we have been successful in what we have seen is that the zeros are still zeros when we receive new information about clandestine graves. That is, a municipality where we said that it's zero, they haven't had clandestine graves findings, because that would be a problem for us, because if we assign the model a municipality a value of 0, but then in future years a fossa or a clandestine grave was found, then we're doing something wrong, and that will affect the model. But at least right now, that has been good for us. Our zeros are still zeros right now. So,
can I ask you to clarify your question? Because I could answer with musings about the difference between predictive and inferential models, which is what I think you may have been asking, or details about what random forests do, which was more specifically what I thought I heard. So let me know, which of those directions would you like me to go? Okay, so when we do a predictive model, something I learned from a political scientist named Phil Schroet is that we don't actually care what the independent variables are. We don't care if they're measured correctly. We don't care what they tell us. All we care is if we've done a good prediction, which depends on the output of our model versus the thing we're predicting. And the closer our model gets to the thing we're predicting, the happier we are. What happens inside the model, we don't know. And many predictive models don't even let us speculate very much about what's inside that model. There are policy problems that derive from that. But I think the larger intellectual sort of issue that I grapple with is, let's not worry about that. If it's a predictive model, if what our purpose is in applying this model and calculating and applying this model is to make predictions, That's one thing we're doing. If we want to understand the phenomenon, if we want to know what the relationship is between our independent variables and the thing we're predicting, we'll choose an inferential model, which the models may actually be mathematically pretty similar, but what we're doing becomes very different. We become, in an inferential context where we're explaining this phenomenon, we become really concerned about whether or not we've measured our independent variables correctly. And bias in our independent variables would then bias our conclusions if we're interpreting those independent variables. In a predictive context, we're not interpreting those independent variables, so we don't actually care very much if the independent variables are in some way poorly measured or biased. So a random forest is one instance of that, where we can only with great difficulty speculate about what the model's doing. And like many predictive models, our only ability to understand what's happening with a particular predictor in the model is whether or not that predictor is important. So if we withdraw that variable from the model, does the model's prediction degrade? And that's all we've got. I mean, we don't actually know if the presence of more paved kilometers of highway increases or decreases the probability of there being a grave. Indeed, because of the way random forests work, it could be increasing sometimes and decreasing at other times. That may not even be a well-formed question. And that's the sort of challenge that much prediction brings with it. This gets even worse in more complex predictive models. We don't have anything like the amount of data required to calculate an artificial neural network or something like that. But in those kinds of models, we get even less ability to predict. There are colleagues of Christian's who are doing work on that, and I think really important work on unpacking that, but I don't think that that work is there. I'm going to grab another second here at the mic. Another person we've not acknowledged or introduced is Dr. Christian Lum, who is my colleague at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group and is our lead statistician and has been so gracious as to moderate the event. So thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so we have a hard stop in 7 minutes, but I wanted to make sure that everyone who wanted to ask a question got to. So how I'd like to proceed now is to have each of you three who remain standing ask your question, and then maybe each of you can respond to one. I'll let you divide it up. And I also noticed that 2 other people who had questions sat down, and I'd very much like to hear your questions as well. So after we do these 3, then we'll do the two people who sat down together, and people can respond to those if that works. If you sat down because you just changed your mind and you no longer have a question, that's fine. So the 3 who were standing a moment ago, if you could please ask in rapid succession.
Hi, Jonathan Drake from AAAS. So in addition to the divergence that you showed between the 2 models, it appeared from the plots that the strength of the correlations got significantly weaker in the mid-range compared to the high and the low ends for each of them. And I'm wondering if you've thought about I'm sure you have, but I'm interested in your thoughts about why that may be, whether it's a lack of data, other input parameters that haven't been thought of yet, or what that might be. Yeah, curious.
All right, and then you 2 over there, please.
Thank you. I'm a little bit short, so I don't know if you can hear me. First, I want to thank you, really, for this presentation. As someone who grew up in one of those dangerous areas, and I saw some of my municipios in your predicted program, is very scary, but it's also very encouraging to know that civil society is doing something, because unfortunately in countries like Mexico, we can't rely on the government to help us solve those problems. And so I had a question. Monica, you mentioned something about how for the families and the communities it's very dangerous even to go out there and look for the graves and look for the information that will help you like feed your model and be able to apply it. So probably this question is more like what you can do in the future, but have you thought about or have you do some research in what kind of alliances you can do with other organizations or groups that use technology to be able to identify the graves? Like if you are able to identify areas where the graves may be, I know there's a lot of technology in archaeology, there's a lot of technology used, that maybe you can bring these groups into it to reduce the risk of the communities to actually search, and maybe this could, like, combination can increase the impact that your program has.
And then you also. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. David Campana. I teach business and human rights in Lima, Peru, at the Peruvian Catholic University. And I wonder if your model could predict not only mass graves, but also who most likely will be the perpetrator. and state or non-state actors, among them companies. And having in mind the international framework for business and human rights, the United Nations Business and Human Rights Principles, they call for the implementation of national action plans, and I know in Mexico there is one. My second question is...
I think we only have time for one question, so thank you. If you guys could, could each respond briefly. No, we're going to go to the other two after those three. So we're going to do those three. You guys each get a chance to respond very briefly, and then we'll do the last two.
Okay. Well, on the use of technology to reducing risks, I mean, there are many things where, like, the families are taking consideration for using this. Currently, they're spending a little bit more money on having this technology brought to the country, but I don't think this will reduce the risk necessarily. I think it will allow other expertise areas to come to join the search. But the thing in Mexico right now is that there is a lot of problems with who are the perpetrators, and a lot of the perpetrators are also state actors. So even though we have this technology, I think, first of all, like, reducing the area will be one challenging step still. And the second, I think that I don't think families will stop going out for the searches if the searches are being conducted by authorities. And even when there are independent experts, I think that they are very well interested in going out and being able to see how the searches are being conducted, and just being part of all the process. So that is a difficult question. I think there are many things we can do.
Thank you.
From technology, but yeah.
All right, so maybe you guys could do 20 seconds apiece.
Yes, I'm going to talk about the last question. This model, it cannot predict the perpetrator, but we are talking about other models that we know we can implement in order to do this. But for example, we need more information of how are these clandestine graves. For example, how many bodies were in the clandestine graves, the type of surface, which tools the perpetrator used during the inhumation of the person, and we can then transform that into another model to try to predict, well, these graves for their characteristics maybe are of this type of perpetrator, and maybe this grave, due to their characteristic, is for another type of perpetrator, and we're working on it, but we need to access more detailed information about how the clandestine grave findings are right now.
Great. So if I'd like to invite the other two people who remain with questions up now. Thank you.
Okay, this is pretty much addressed to Patrick, but other people. Obviously, it's a dynamic situation, and my question is, I don't know how publicly available word about your research has been. Did the press publicize it? Did the media talk about it? Which then leads to my question about knowledge of this work and how it would affect the behavior of the perpetrators. Patrick earlier said, and I had an original question, well, not everybody just kills the person and dumps them under some soil. They may, unfortunately, cut up the bodies. They may throw them down a garbage chute, horrible things. But this is not what you're looking for. You're looking for some physical presence under some mounds of earth. And the larger question is the feedback loop. Those who are the objects of the work of the model getting word of it and therefore changing their modus operandi.
I thought I would just let it go, but since you give me the space. My question is around how widespread can this be? I mean, there have been definitely missing people from U.S. cruise ships, from U.S. visitors. Have you reached out or have you had interaction with the U.S. government in terms of finding missing people?
Thank you so much. So we are out of time, but I think each of you can have maybe 15 seconds to respond. So
I want to grab the two of the questions from the previous round. One was on why there's a difference between press and the Fiscalia data. And the second question is, can we predict state versus non-state actors? And in both, rather than answering directly, I want to reflect on what is it that machine learning does. What machine learning does is model the observed data. So if we have nothing to model against, we're going to continue with the false negative problem in both cases. So until we have data on perpetrators, which we basically have none of in Mexico, we can't model for it. I don't think that we can use some sort of unsupervised model. We need to figure out some of the data on perpetrators so we can model the rest of it, and we don't have anything. So I think we have no leverage there. But on the difference between the two cases, I think they're going to continue to diverge because the two, my point is that those two data streams are actually observing different things. And so it's entirely appropriate that one be unable to model all of the cases in the other. Many are the same, but sometimes they're different, and it's appropriate and useful as an alert to what's being observed to think about the way the model's failing. It's not so much a model failure as it is the model's reflecting the difference in the information that's being produced.
My question was more about the strength of the correlation in the mid-range in each model.
Yeah, let's have that discussion at the break.
Yeah.
Thanks. You guys want to respond?
No, I will only like to add to the last question. We haven't been in talks with the U.S. government, but we have been talking with other organizations, for example, like the National Security Archive, which they also have information of some of the violence in Mexico, especially in the north. And yes, we're still in talks to see if they have some type of information that we can add, but I think that's it.
All right. And Monica, do you want to finish us up here? Last words, last responses to any of the questions.
No, just I really want to thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks, and I think we'll all be around at the break if anyone would like to ask further questions or if anything didn't get answered. Thank you.